Okay.
And then I'm just gonna sit. I'm gonna just sit.
Okay.
Trying to think.
Give me some kind of a guideline, unless I mean, I'll talk.
Yeah.
Uh,
So look at me, and then you'll just be answering the questions to me.
okay, go.
And so for the first question, just state your name and.
My name is Robin Stewart McRae, but I was known as Sandy from the time I was like 2 years old because I had sandy-colored hair. So people who knew me early on have always called me Sandy, and my name as an eye doctor was Robin. So I always used to tell the lady that was in the office, if somebody calls and wants to talk to Sandy, put them through. If somebody calls and wants to talk to Robin, you talk to them and find out what they want to know about. But anyway, that's the name. I was born in Boise, 1939. Went through Boise Junior College. I graduated from the University of Oregon in 1964, and I graduated from optometric school in Pacific University in 1967, and I practiced in Wallace, Idaho for about 4 months to get my feet under me, and then I moved to Boise and had a practice here for 37 years, and that was my working life for the most part as a eye doctor, and then I was involved in mines to some degree, and also have had an interest in land in and around Big Creek, Edwardsburg, for the last 50, 60 years.
So tell me about, did you grow up in Stibnite, or did you grow up in...
Pretty much. We lived in McCall for the first 3 years of my life. My grandmother was the postmaster in McCall from 1914 to 1932, and was quite well known because of that. And she then had what they called Cook's Beach, which had cabins on it, and that's where Brown's Palaces are now, because it got sold to Warren Brown, the Brown Time Lumber Company, and they built condominiums on the property. But at the time, in the 40s, it had cabins, and when I was born, my dad had just been out of school about 4 years, and he was working for Herbert Hoover, traveling around the country looking at mines, and also working at Thunder Mountain and Big Creek. So he had a life in Idaho as well as out of Idaho to a degree. And at one point, then the Yellow Pine Mine, which we'll call Stibnite, when they discovered tungsten ore body, then the whole game changed in 1942. And my father then was asked, because he knew, because of his relationship with Thunder Mountain, which you'd have to go through Stibnite to get to Thunder Mountain for the most part, they knew about him, and they asked him if he would become an engineer for them, and so he agreed. And in 1942 October, he moved to Stibnite and became the mill superintendent in Stibnite. And we moved into Stibnite in 1943, June. So we moved from McCall in June of 1943 to Stibnite, and we lived there until 1954, because the mine ultimately closed down in 1952, but there was some exploration done before they just basically disseminated everything. And my dad was in charge of the exploration of the properties. that they were looking at. And I went through all 8th grades at the mine. When I graduated out of the 8th grade, there were 4 of us in the 8th grade class. And then I had to go to high school, so my father said, well, we're going to move to Boise. So we came to Boise, and I entered South Junior High, which is just down the way here, 4 blocks, and then went through Boise High School, and we're last class to get out of Boise High School before Bora went. So we had a distinction of being the last graduating class of Boise High.
Explain to me some of the activity that was going on in the Frank Church Wilderness before it became the wilderness.
Well, when we were at the mine, the Stibnite mine, my father was always interested in the sunny side. I mean, before it was ever thought of being patented necessarily. But he always felt like that there was probably a mine there at some point, depending on the price of gold. And when the price of gold got, when Nixon took the gold standard off and the price then went from $35 up to $100, then people got kind of interested, and then it kept nudging up, and my father, he pretty much felt that was what was going to happen. He didn't know for sure, but that was his impression that was what ultimately would happen to the price of gold. And that he didn't know how high it would go, but he felt like it was going to become worthwhile to hold on to a property that had the likelihood of an ore deposit that would be economical to mine and to endeavor with. And so we meaning the kids and my mother, we would take weekends, would drive from Thunder Mountain or drive from Stibnite to Thunder Mountain and spend the day. And my dad would do sampling and looking for more zones of potential gold. And so we were doing that almost, probably in the summer. You couldn't do it in the winter because the road was shut then. But we were over there almost at least 2 weekends every month from July, August, September, and October. And
how many mining operations were going on when you were growing up in the Frank Church?
There was in the Frank Church, there was very little mines going on when I was growing up while we were at Stibnite. When Stibnite was not in the Frank Church, it was on the edge of it. And the Thunder Mountain had an investor that put in, I can't remember the numbers, but probably $250,000 into the Dewey. And my dad helped them with their metallurgy on that. And I can remember going over with him, and they actually built some buildings in 1947 and 48. And were getting ready to start open pitting, and then they ran out of money. And that ended that adventure. But there was never, other than just plastering, and there was a little bit of that going on at the Dewey, where people could, in the summer, regulate water control, and they could get enough water to placer enough gold to make it worthwhile. And I remember going over there when this was going on, and my dad used to, he was always interested in what these, because most of the people that were doing that were people that had worked over there in the 30s They were familiar with the Dewey, and to some degree familiar with Sunnyside. And the property in 1935, a company out of Spokane bought the Dewey ore body, and it was mined and then hauled over. The trucks hauled the ore over to the Sunnyside, to the mill that was put up in 1924 by my grandfather and my dad. And in 1935, they added a ball mill and got rid of the stamps that went up and down. So the ball mill was where you take balls and put them into a container and put the ore in there, and it grinds it up into a sandy kind of stuff, and then puts it on a table and jigs it, and then the gold will separate. And the company, I don't know how much money was put into there. I suppose they probably put, in the 30s, they probably put in $200,000 or $300,000, and to get the mine open at the Dewey, hauling the ore over, getting it processed, and then getting it sold. And they would bring it down here to the because in the 30s you had gold had to be sold through certain channels. You weren't allowed to own gold unless you were a dealer and coins and that sort of thing. So you couldn't. So if you were going to buy gold, you had to sell it to the government, and the assay office down in Boise here was the place that you brought your gold and sold it to them, because they were a part of the government, and they would give you the money then, and then you could go. And so during the from 1924 to 1935, the family plastered on the Dewey and made about $6,000 to $7,000 a year doing that. And they employed about 4 different individuals besides just the family.
What family was this?
Well, that was the McRaes. My grandfather, my dad, and then Jim Collard in 1933 became part of the family and was also employed. And then he married my aunt in 34, and so he became part of the family. And so Jim was then part of that. And that's how he became involved with the Thunder Mountain. And he was pretty young when that happened. He was in his early 20s when they first brought him over there. And he was a strapping, strong guy, and they made good use of his muscle. And he worked underground with 4 or 5 other guys that were miners, and along with my father. And my father was involved in the mill as well as my grandfather, but my father also worked underground as well. And that's how he got silicosis and lost 40% of his lung capacity because of that in the 1920s or 30s. And that affected his whole life after that to a degree, and that's what killed him ultimately. So the Dewey ore was mined, and that was then closed down during the Second World War, because all gold mines were shut down. It was deemed not a necessary endeavor, and you couldn't use diesel or gasoline or metal or basically food to deal with crews that were working on gold mines. So, in 1942, the mine closed on the Sunnyside. And it stayed closed then on the Sunnyside
that's
until...
different from the Dewey, right? The Sunnyside is a different mine than the Dewey mine?
The two are only a mile apart, but they have the same. The Dewey has a little different metallurgy, but the Dewey, the material that came from the Dewey over to the Sunnyside to go through the mill was mined in 1936, 37, 38, 39, 40, and 41. And then the government edict came down, 402 or whatever it was, and that closed every mine that was a gold mine. And so that took care of that. And the Sunnyside quit working underground in the 30s. 30, yeah. But for the most part, the Sunnyside didn't mine anything underground after about 1936, and that ended there where they were tramming the gold down to the mill that the lady was riding in the bucket. All the gold ore was coming from the Dewey. And when that closed, then the Dewey became under separate ownership, and the Sunnyside then stayed with the family. And the Marie Dewey Davis, Colonel Dewey, who had the Dewey mine early on, but he died when he was in 1903, but his family had an ownership in the Sunnyside to a degree. And my grandfather then made contracts with the Dewey family, and that's how they were able then to stay on the Sunnyside. And then ultimately they were able to get a hold of it totally without the Dewey family involvement in it. I think they paid them a certain amount of money. I don't remember, it wasn't a whole lot, but they paid the Dewey. That most of those kids lived over in Nampa, and they had the Dewey Palace Hotel over in Nampa, and so the mine then became the family endeavor, and until the price of gold went up high enough because of the deregulation that then they began to get interests from people wanting to come in and look at it and to drill it and to sample it. And that happened in the 70s, and not so much in the 60s, although there might have been a little bit, but mostly in the 70s. And then in the 80s is when Phillips Petroleum and Coeur d'Alene Mines got really seriously involved in it. And then Coeur d'Alene bought Phillips Petroleum out of the property and gave them some kind of a royalty. I don't remember what the amount was. So, and then the mine then started, and they had, Sunnyside had, they did a leach operation, so they cleared off a whole swath of timber, probably about the only flat area that they could put leach pads on, and leached the ore from the Sunnyside, and they employed about 48 individuals, engineers and workers and truck drivers and whatever. And that they had a cookhouse and a bunkhouse, and that was the mine life until it closed in 1989. And then it went through renovation for about 3 years, where all of the areas that had been mined were reclaimed and planted with trees and shrubs to eliminate erosion for the most part. And And that then was pretty much the end of the life of the Thunder Mountain endeavor until we sold the property to Public Trust for Lands, and then that went to the Forest Service, and now you have access limitedly, but still access. You can go over and rockhound and take pictures, and the Forest Service actually were talking about putting a campground in on the Dewey, which I don't think will ever happen, but they did keep the Dewey building. It's still there. It hasn't been torn down or burned. So thanks to Agnew, who did do a lot of that sort of thing, unfortunately. He didn't do that to the Dewey cabin. And
can you talk more about Agnew and him burning down cabins?
Well, he did burn a couple of places in Stibnite that I was aware of, and Scott Amos has researched a lot of that, and he has data on quite a bit of that sort of thing. And then there were threats to burn cabins that were not necessarily on the patented lands on Thunder Mountain, but were cabins that had been put in early on, at the time probably of Roosevelt, and then rehabbed a little bit. And there were rumors that the Forest Service was going to go in and start burning those cabins. Bill Tim's cabin that Scott just put a picture on the computer, which you could see if you look up his Facebook, it's on there. That was built in 1903. Bill Tim came into Thunder Mountain in 1902, and as an assayer, he graduated from Stanford University along with Herbert Hoover, who was a mining engineer as well. And he became an assayer at Roosevelt, and then he ran for public office and got to be a representative from Roosevelt in the legislature. And he had to snowshoe out to get to the Capitol building, or at least part of that anyway. Anyway, Bill Tim's cabin is about maybe a mile or a mile and a half after you leave the flat, where you can walk from the flat down to Roosevelt, which is about 3/4 of a mile. But if you then take the road up toward the sunny side and the Dewey, the cabin is off to the left, and it's been rehabbed, because my father actually rehabbed the cabin in 1951 because we had a watchman at Thunder Mountain that was looking after the buildings. Now, all of the buildings on the sunny side got destroyed at the time of the mining. The Coeur d'Alene mines burned them all, except for one, and that's where the road that they reclaimed from the main, what we'll call the supervisor's cabin, and that cabin is still there. Scott's got a picture of it on the internet as well. But the cabin that Bill Tim had claims on Lower Big Creek as well, on Ramey Ridge. And he then came to Roosevelt in 1949 when they dedicated a plaque at the cemetery at Roosevelt. And my father was instrumental in getting this plaque done. It's a brass plaque with 13 names of people who for sure were known to have been buried in the cemetery, out of about 45 people who were buried on the hillside, and nobody knows their names anymore, and all they did was scab a tree and put a date on it, and so a lot of names and people got just forgotten. But the people who were known, and Bill Tim was one of the people who knew some of them, because he had provided at their funerals. at Roosevelt, and so did my grandfather. And so the Stibnite village raised money to buy the brass plaque. It's about a 4-foot by 3-foot plaque with names on it and dates. And that was taken over to Roosevelt Lake, taken down. The cemetery is about a quarter of a mile below the lake, and it's on a patented claim that my father bought from Bradley Mining Company that had stibnite. So we actually owned a cemetery at one point, and my mother tried to donate that cemetery to the to the Sierra Club, and the Sierra Club here in Boise says, we don't have any money to take care of cemeteries, so you're going to have to go somewhere else. Well, we turned around and sold the claim, which was 19 acres, to a guy from Chalice. He paid us $30,000 for it, and I thought, I'm not going to argue there. You know, the environmentalists lost out on that deal. So anyway, Bill Tim then came in, and that was the last time. He died about 7 months after he came to the cemetery in Roosevelt. I didn't get to go to the ceremony, but they had about probably 15 or 20 people that worked, and they put a cable around the cemetery and cleaned it up and put markers on the ground with the people's names on it, besides just the plaque that we put in on a slant, and they put it in cement so nobody could steal it. And so that was one of the things that the village did. And there's a picture on the wall in there. Once we're done, you can look at it. It has me and my sister and my father and my grandfather in front of the plaque. The Statesman came in and took a picture of it and ran it in the Statesman. And that was a bit odd, because after that picture ran, my mother took us to McCall to see my grandmother, and some guy came up to me on the street, because we had a Great Dane dog while we were in Stibnite. We had the biggest damn dog that anybody ever had up there, and we had Great Danes for about 10 years. Anyway, I had this dog on a leash, and this guy came up to me, and he said, "That's a beautiful dog." And I said, yeah. And he looked at me and he says, "Hell," he says, "I saw your picture in the paper the other day." And I was just embarrassed. I mean, I didn't know what to say to this guy. I mean, I was like 9 years old. You know, my mother was in the store shopping in the department store, and he started petting the dog, and when my mother came out, I says, "This guy seemed to recognize me from a picture in the paper." And she says, "Well, that's because that cemetery picture was in there." Oh, okay, then it came back, but I had no idea what he was talking about, you know, and I was like, anyway, Bill Tim had claims, and I don't know how old he was then. He probably was 77, 78 when he passed away in California, because he didn't live in Idaho. He came up pretty much every summer, and he would go into Big Creek because he had Wilbur Wiles, the cougar hunter, take him down to his claims and do this. He would file claim work on claims with the Forest Service and the BLM or whoever the claims are with. And so that was one cabin that they had rumors they were going to burn, and Scott just went bananas. That's how I first became aware of Scott Amos, because of all of this. I didn't know Scott when he was a kid in Yellow Pine. I mean, we'd stop in Yellow Pine, but, you know, I wouldn't have known him or his brothers from Adam, you know, because we would just stop and have something to drink and maybe something to eat, and we'll go on over to Big Creek. So anyway, Scott became enamored with the cabin because it is in good shape. And my dad re-roofed it and re-floored it in 1951 for the guy that was the watchman for us. And so that's why it's maintained its stability as now. It looks, pretty viable, and I think it's had some work done on the foundations as well. It's not a great big cabin. It's probably 400 square feet, if nothing. It has a wood stove in it and a bed, and that's about it, and a couple of windows. But so that was one of the cabins that had been rumored to be on the list. And Scott just wrote letters to everybody. And finally the Forest Service have laid off from it. And I think they're going to not mess with it, fortunately. So Scott's a very, he's an impressive individual when it comes to getting things done through media.
What about the cabins that have been burned down? Are you
Well, the cabins that have been burned down, the ones that were down on Marble Creek, that my mother could never get over the fact that, and I still can't say that fellow's name. I've got his picture and stuff in there, but I can't say his name at the moment. But he was an old fellow that he was married. And one of the reasons that he sold to the Forest Service was because of his wife wanted to leave. She didn't like to live down there in those conditions, And my mother and my aunt, Marge Collard, would go down and spend a few days with the family down there, and she just was absolutely livid when, and of course that wasn't Agnew. This was back in the early 40s when they did that, and they were talking about building an airport there, and it never happened. And then down below the lake on Monumental, below Roosevelt Lake, the ranch there had an airport on it, and my mother and my aunt both flew into that airport in a double wing Stearmans. Planes that now you'd probably pay a lot of money to ride in, but in those years, that's what when they built the airport in Stibnite, then you could land there and then walk over. And the cabins otherwise have pretty much, that I know of, have pretty much been demolished by forest fires for the most part now, because of I don't know, you can call it climate change, whatever you want, but the forest fires are more aggressive and more prominent, and a lot of cabins in the backcountry got wiped out. And the Caswell cabin below the Dewey, there's a road that goes down to where the cabins were. If you drove to the Dewey mine, and then you could take the road down, which was less than a half a mile, and the cabin had furniture in it. And that lamp was one of them right there. That came out of the Dewey cabin on Mule Creek, because my grandmother went down when they went in there in 1914 and got lamps because they didn't have any lamps. And that was one of them, and then they had another one in Big Creek, and my uncle took it and had it electrified, so he put a bulb in it. This one has never been that way. I salvaged it, and it's a choline, not a choline, but not diesel fuel, but whatever you put in the lamps to make them work. It has a wick about that big around on it. So that cabin got burned up about 6 years ago, just wiped it out because the fire came up. It didn't come up to the mine site. It stopped right below there, but it wiped the Caswell cabin out. And they had built that in I think they built that cabin in 1899. And it had a bed in it and a big back I can remember looking at it in 25 years ago. I was down there, and the roof had come down, but you could see a bedstead that was pretty fancy. But the whole roof was laying on the materials and the chairs and whatever else. And that cabin then burned, and the cabins down below, which were the first ones that the Caswells ever built, were just below the lake, not 100 yards below the lake. And they got burned up. And I have pictures of those as well.
Who burned them up? Was it just nature?
That was nature.
What about the cabins that the Forest Service burnt down?
Well, the one at where the airport was, below the lake, about 4 miles or 5 miles, they took that as an administrative site, and they went down and burned it. And, you know, whether that came out of McCall or whether that came out of higher up, I couldn't tell you. But that was before Agnew's time, and, you know, that was probably in 1946 or 7 that the cabin down below the lake got burned. And that made my mom mad because they used to go down there and visit with the people that stayed there because it had an airport. It had enough area that they could grow gardens, and they could actually raise a few cows there.
Do you have a picture of that cabin somewhere? I guess where was it located? You said it was right below Roosevelt.
Yeah, it was below the lake. The McCoy Ranch is or the Hughes Ranch. The guy that might have a picture of that, possibly. There are some pictures, and I probably have one. I'm not sure I could put my hand on it. Is the fellow in McCall, Richard Holmes, that did the airport book, which I supplied a whole bunch of pictures for that old boy. And because there was an airport there, I think he may have a cabin picture of that in his book, which I have in there in the bookcase.
What's the cabin called again?
Well, it was Hughes early on, and then it was McCoy's. McCoy's were the later owners of it. And that would have been in the Hugheses were the people who had the ranch when my grandparents went in 1914. Because my grandmother stayed with the Hugheses while my grandfather went up to the Dewey and rehabbed the cabin at the Dewey mine because they'd killed a guy in the cabin. They'd shot him, and they buried him right outside the cabin. And
who shot them? Who?
There were people that were in there that were. They got permission from the Colonel Dewey's family to stay in there, and they could pan enough gold to buy enough booze to make a living. And some of those guys didn't want to be out in society because they probably had warrants against them. And so that was the reason why my grandmother told my grandfather, "I will not live in a cabin where there are bullet holes in the walls." And they had bought this guy up from, he was down Mule Creek, brought him up. They didn't like him. They left a pistol on the dining room table. Another guy came out of the kitchen, which had a door to it, and called the guy a name and said, they got in an argument, and the guy reached for the pistol, and they put 4 bullets in him right there. And some of the bullets he shot went through the door to the kitchen. And my grandmother told my grandfather, says, "You clean those bullet holes up, or I am not going to be staying in the cabin." And then the guys also were living up in the attic of there's a picture of the Dewey cabin on the wall in there. It burned down in 1949. They would lie in bed and shoot flies on the ceiling with pistols. And so my grandfather had to recover the cabin as well before they could because they were in there in April. That's when they started from Big Creek. And they stayed with the Edwardses in Big Creek, got up at 3 a.m, went up to the cabin on Cougar Basin, stayed overnight, and then the next day they went down, and my grandmother took my father, who was 6 years old, and my aunt, who was 3 years old, and went down to the Hughes' ranch at that time and stayed there for a week while my grandfather was up working on the cabin at the Dewey. And then everybody moved up to the Dewey, and that's where they lived, in the cabin. And they brought a guy in from Grangeville, who, that was Grangeville was the county seat at that time. There was no Valley County, it was Idaho County. And they looked at this body that they had killed outright, and they ran a check on this buddy, and he was wanted for rustling in around Vail. And so the guy that came from Grangeville said, "Good riddance." And they just buried him right there underneath the steps.
Can you tell me about, we talked about the relationship that the Forest Service had with miners, and back in the day, it was better. It was
better, no question about it, because they wanted people, they wanted people to have an economic reason to be there. I mean, that was part of it. I mean, the wilderness didn't enter into any of this kind of stuff. They wanted people to be able to make a living, whether it was trapping. Wilbur Wiles trapped cougar, bountied cougar. He would get $75 a pelt for cougars, and he could bounty anywhere up to 50 to 60 cougars a season, and with his dogs and his horses. Or he would trap marten and mink, and he'd sell the pelts to furs people. And, there were people around Big Creek that just did that for trapping, and that's how they made a living. And the Forest Service agreed to all of that. I mean, there was never any reason to, you're never bothered by the Forest Service. They would help you out if you got into trouble. They'd bring groceries in for you if you needed it. Or if you had medical things, they'd help you get to where you needed to go to have some medical care if you needed something like that. So the Forest Service, until probably in the 1960s, it began to get a little different. And then when the wilderness became wilderness in 1964, regulations then got printed, but they gave everybody a 20-year window to get used to this, and then the door would shut tight. And so, as I said, my father got along with the Forest Service. He would, to build a road, he'd go ahead and survey it out and take a cat from the mine up on Elk Summit and build a road, and then he'd go tell the Forest Service what he did. And they'd said, "Well, did you do it in a manner that was acceptable?" And he'd say, "Yeah, it was acceptable." And that was all that was said. There was never anything said about, well, you disturbed the land and blah, 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 blah. He had a reason to do it because he had mineral that he wanted to get exposed to and maybe to potentially mine. And so, that was our experience, okay? And then when we had the mine up on Elk Summit and employed the people, the Forest Service stayed away. They didn't mess with us. They didn't come up and inspect the tailings pond. They didn't do anything, really. They just stayed out of your hair. And then later on, one of the gals that worked for the Forest Service in Big Creek employed a guy to go up and burn the cabins on the mine site in I'm going to guess now, but it was in the early 1970s, because Wilbur Wiles knew who did it. And she said, well, lightning struck. Well, Wilbur says, that was kind of funny because everything got piled up in one big pile. God was really looking after you then. Well, hell, they paid a guy $100 to go up and torch all of the buildings that were there. There was 4 buildings. We tore the mill down and brought it down to Big Creek and sold the lumber, because there was a lot of shiplap lumber in the mill. And we sold that in Big Creek to people. But the cabins were prefabs that came out of Stibnite Mine. And they just burned them right there and just piled it all up. And they left the outhouses, but they burned the cabins. And Wilbur says, yeah, what's her name? They called her Peppermint Patty, is the one that she was a wilderness ranger or whatever. They were having wilderness rangers now, and which was the first time that I'd ever heard that term in 1970s, and that's what Earl Dodd says. You think that we're tough nuts? You wait till that crew's getting out the next year or two out of the school, and then you're going to know what it's like to be in the wilderness. And he was right, no question about it.
Where were those cabins burned down? Peppermint Patty, whatever. Where?
Well, they were on the mine site.
Were they the Dewey site? Where were they?
No, they were. That was on Elk Summit.
Elk Summit.
That was 9 miles from Big Creek. My dad put the mine in on Elk Summit. I've got a story in here about the mine and pictures of the mine and the buildings. I can show them to you when we get done here.
Patty, is there any documentation about her burning those places? And
well, she didn't. She paid the money to have the guy do it. And Wilbur Wiles came to me and says, I was privileged to hearing her talk about it at the old lodge. She was in there having dinner, and she was talking to the lodge people about it. And she just told them what she had done. And Wilbur said, I didn't say a word, but he came and told me what had happened. And well, they didn't belong to my dad. My dad had sold the buildings and the land. It was not patented land. And he sold that to another guy. And so we had no ownership in it, and so we had no axe to grind. But people would go up there and stay in those cabins and hunt. And when they got burned, my dad got a few calls from people saying, what did you do that for? And he says, well, I didn't do it. That was the Forest Service did that. And so it was another one of those kind of issues. And well, anyway, and then when the wilderness went through Cabin Creek, they burned all the buildings because the Forest Service bought Cabin Creek, paid Rex Lanham, Kathy Gillahan's dad, that we just talked about, $1,200,000 for Cabin Creek, because he had put in a pretty nice bunch of cabins there, and he had big shots from all over the country coming down to Cabin Creek, staying there. People from Washington, D.C. bringing their girlfriends down there, and he kept track of every one of them. All he had to do was call up a representative and say, I need this done. And if the guy gave him any squawk, he'd say, well, do you want me to tell your wife that you were in there with? No. So, anyway, they burned all of the cabins there on the ranch. All they kept was one cabin. And they said, we'll keep that in case somebody gets stuck down there, because there is an airport. And if they got stuck there for weather, or what, they'd be able to get in out of the rain and snow, or well, probably not snow, but at least rain. But all of that stuff got burned. And then they went on down to Dewey Moore's place, which was the next. Dewey Moore's ranch was the first ranch that you came to after you came to the end of the road that you could drive down before the wilderness became wilderness. And it had, I've got pictures of the of the Dewey Moore place as well. All those buildings got burned. And they actually took a cat down there and they buried the cat. They still left the airport, which was a terrible airport. It was always bad. If you didn't land just right, you were dead duck. And but
the
so
Dewey Moore cabin is on Big Creek, right?
Yeah, and it was on private land. And all of those cabins got burned because of the wilderness. And then the next ranch down was owned by a former World War II fighter pilot who had probably post-mortem issues, and he came in there to get away from the public. And he built an airport on the next lodge or next ranch down and had a little cabin there. And he just lived there for, probably 6 or 7 years maybe. And we had a kind of a funny story about him. We took the horses when we were cutting trail for the Forest Service. He was across Big Creek. And so we had to ford Big Creek to get over to him. And we were kind of hungry, and so we thought we'd go over there and have lunch, which we had brought with us. And we got all of the stuff across. I can remember my horse had to damn near swim to get through. And we got over there, the four of us, and the old boy came to the door of iced tea. And he looked down at us and he says, "You guys, you got them old logger boots on." He said, "I want you to clean your feet before you walk into my place." And okay. So we cleaned our feet on a rug outside the door, walked in, and hell, it was a dirt floor. And he laughed and says, "Well, he says, we got to have a little humor in this life, don't we?" And then after that, he started giving us some stuff. And he says, he says, "My dogs would just love you guys to give them a little bit of food there." And he said, "Nothing will ever touch the floor." And so we'd put like that, and the dog would poof, just like that, man. It was right down. We had a great time there. We were there for probably an hour and a half, something like that. And he then sold that to well, anyway, he sold the place, and then it got sold to the Forest Service for $250,000, and that guy got paid $35,000 to get off from it. That's what the Forest Service paid him. And then, because it was private land, there was a lawsuit filed in it, and the Forest Service had to give it up, and they had burned his cabin. But the guy that took the land was able then to sell it to the Forest Service for $300,000 to the Idaho First National Bank. It was his dad. Docky Bettis married one of the women who was an heir to the bank, and they were all millionaires, and some of them more than millionaires. And Harry was watching the Dewey mine because he had an ownership in the Dewey, which he sold to Ron Yonke. And he rode his horse down to this ranch and made a deal to buy the property for, I think he gave him, $60,000 or $70,000. He then turned around and sold it to the government for $300,000. And that's the way Harry Bettis was. He was very cagey when it came to how to make money. And it was...
So the Forest Service bought it, and then they did burn down the cabins.
Yeah, it was gone. Yep.
Do you know why exactly the Forest Service would burn down these cabins?
They just didn't want people there. They thought it was a liability, because if somebody was using it and that if they got hurt, they'd get sued. So they just said, get rid of it. That was basically their attitude of it. And plus, if there's no cabin there aren't going to be people going over there messing with it, or camped out or whatever, that was the other thing, So it was...
Can you talk briefly about Jim Collard?
Yeah.
And the contention, why he did not like the Forest Service?
Well, Jim didn't like the Forest Service because of their high-handed attitude toward the mineral rights that were legitimate and that were probably good enough that you could maybe file for a patent. And at this point, this would have been when Reagan was around in president, and his Secretary of Interior had said that he was never going to let another patent go in the Idaho wilderness. And that upset my uncle, even though he probably saw the handwriting on the wall. But when he got denied the possible patent on the property down Lower Big Creek that Wilbur Wiles had discovered and done some work on, and then Jim had, and then the little Jim Collard as well, did the work on it, and it did turn out to have a value. And that's when the suit was filed, and it went 8 years before, from Boise back to the appellate courts in Virginia. And then when the decision came down, Jim was given, but he was dying, and he was not going to file any patents on it. But he did get all of his money back, plus about $150,000 that he paid Jeff Faraday for the lawsuit.
You told me he sued the Forest Service, correct?
Yep. Absolutely.
Why did he?
Because they gated him. He couldn't go down and do any work on it. They said, and we're not going to let you have access to it. And that just made him mad because he thought he had a reasonably entitlement to it, And then they said, well, that's in the wilderness now. Well, it might have been in the wilderness, but the claims were legal. And they were proven to be legal, at least part of them, not all of them, but part of them, because that was the decision on the appellate court. They said, you did that old boy wrong. That's what they told the Forest Service, and so you're going to have to pay for it. And so they ponied it up.
Where was that?
It was just within a quarter of a mile of where Monumental Creek and Big Creek come together. And it was off of the main road, because there was a road there. It was a trail now, but it was a road before that. And then, as I said, they gated the road below the airport when 1983 turned that year, because that's when the wilderness became in effect. And they gave Jim Collard a key to get a few things off of the property, and he went down there once and was able to get some stuff off that he'd left there, some camp equipment or something. And another guy got another key for a piece of property just above there that had quite a bit of stuff left there. And they let him take a mule train down and haul that stuff out on mules. And a kid from the Forest Service, or not Forest Service, a kid from Yellow Pine was the guy that did that.
When Jim Collard sold his land, or his claims...
he didn't sell them, he just gave them up.
When he gave them up...
Yeah, but he got paid for the lawsuit, and he got paid to some degree for the claims that they didn't allow him to function or to develop.
I thought he sold it to the trust, and then the...
No, that's Thunder Mountain.
That's Thunder Mountain.
The trust didn't have anything to do with that area down there. That's how he got mad at the Forest Service.
Okay.
Forest Service would come through and one of the guys that was a forest ranger, and they had quite a few. Nobody wanted to be a forest ranger in Big Creek because, there were enough codgers around Big Creek, and they knew that they were not liked. And Jim, I was in the cabin, their cabin there, one time having dinner, and this guy knocks on the door, and it was a guy that was now the district ranger. He'd just been appointed. And so Marge, my aunt, went over to the door and opened the front door. And this guy says, "I'm so-and-so, and I'm the new district ranger. And I'm here to throw my hat into the mix here." He says, "I hear you don't like Forest Service people very much." And Jim says, "By God, you got that right, sir." And he says, "Oh, okay. Well, I just want to introduce myself." He says, "Well, fine. Turn around and get in your car and get the hell out of here." And that was all that was said. We just went, yeah. So that was the attitude. Those guys, they presumably were doing what they had to do in order to maintain a job, but it was pretty sad the way that they had their relationship with the natives, as it would be. And I can just say that Jim was very expressive when it came to the farce service. That's how he called it, their farce service, and he had all sorts of land of no good use. That's what he called wilderness. He had a whole bunch of bumper stickers printed up, land of no use. I've got a few of them here that I inherited that you could rip off and put on your bumper if you wanted to. I didn't do that. I don't put bumpers on anything, but he just liked to tweak them. That was his deal. He just enjoyed that immensely. It was part of entertainment back there. People needed something to divert their attentions. That's what I always figured. And my aunt would say, Now Jim, settle down." He'd calm down, but it didn't take much to set him off when it came to the Forest Service. But when they went up and burned the buildings, on the McRae mine up on Elk Summit, he was pretty upset. And even though we didn't have, as a family, didn't have any ownership in it anymore, it was out of our hands. But it was history. You could go up there and see it, and I helped tear the buildings down over at Stibnite. We did that the last year we were living there, 1953. We tore two prefab buildings down, and they did them wall and roof, and then they loaded the walls on a truck. They didn't take them apart, and then they just put it all together when they got over there.
After Jim sold the Thunder Mountain land, did they burn down some of the structures that he had there?
No, not really, because all of the structures were destroyed by the mine, and that was done because they used it as a place to put spent ore. And they said, we're going to burn them, and they documented all of them. And there was like 11 cabins there on the sunny side, and they documented all of them. They paid for I have the document right here that they employed the University of Idaho, and they also employed the Idaho State University to go up and study all of the cabins and make a historic study, look to see if there was any Indian involvement, which there wasn't much. And to be sure that if you were going to burn these cabins, that they weren't going to be burning up something that was historic in a way. I suppose to our view, it was historic, but it was also for the good of the endeavor. So if you had to let the cabins go, so be it. That's what we did. And the only cabin left is the superintendent's, And Scott can talk to you about that. He's got pictures of it on his camera because he put it on the internet the other day, and it's still there. But none of the other cabins were ever burned. Forest Service, what they did later, when the mill that we said was brought up and built by my family in 1924, that building has been, and I don't know this for a fact, so I shouldn't probably say it, but that building is now collapsed, and it looks to me like it might have been possibly lit on fire to some degree. And if that's the case, it would only have been either lightning or somebody else doing it. And Scott took some pictures of that. I haven't been to that mill now. And the room that we have in the other room here, I went in and took wood off of the mill, and I paneled that room in the other room there with the wood. And that wood came from down on the head of Marble Creek. So it went from there to there, and then I went in and bought a pickup load of it out, and we put it on the wall when we added that room by the kitchen. And so anyway, no, none of those buildings were involved. What they did was they cut the roads and made it so you could just get a four-wheeler around. So they brought in big, huge rocks as big as those chairs and put them, and they just made it wide enough so you could get a four-wheeler through it, but not a car or a Jeep. So they limited access in that regard. And the only other access that they didn't limit was to go up to Lightning Peak on the road that I said they had to rebuild. And so none of those buildings were ever, everything else would have been forest fires. And the forest fires came up Mule Creek, and they burned the Caswell cabin halfway up, and they burned the Caswell cabins on lower Mule Creek, which is below the lake. So those all got destroyed by Mother Nature. So.
Well, Sandy, I got to get going.
Okay, I got you.
But it has been